the invisible hands controlling you. You would be surprised if you truly counted how many of your decisions today were shaped by someone else's expectations. A tone of voice, a raised eyebrow, a delayed message, a moment of silence that felt heavier than it should have. Most people move through their days unaware of how often they hand over their emotional state to forces that have no right to hold it. It happens subtly, quietly, almost elegantly, not through dramatic attacks, but through small psychological nudges that steer your reactions without you noticing. And the truth is both simple and uncomfortable. Manipulation rarely comes from those who openly oppose you. It comes from the people, situations, and stories you allow too close to your sense of self. This is where the Stoics were brutally honest. They believed that the mind is conquered not by enemies, but by interpretations. No one can enter your inner life unless you leave the door open. But most of us were never taught how to close that door. We were taught to keep the peace, to avoid tension, to respond quickly, to make others comfortable, to fit into invisible emotional expectations. The result is a life that feels reactive instead of intentional. A life where the slightest shift in someone's energy can override your clarity. You feel pulled instead of self-directed. You feel influenced instead of anchored. And deep down you know it. This video exists to reveal the shift that ends that cycle at its root, not by turning you cold or distant, but by teaching you to reclaim the space inside yourself where decisions are made. The Stoic shift is a change in posture, a shift in awareness, a moment when you decide that your mind belongs entirely to you again, when you stop absorbing every emotional cue around you, when you learn to see human behavior as information rather than personal attack, when you develop the ability to observe instead of instantly reacting, when you stop letting anyone's tone, threat, or tension dictate the direction of your life. Think about how different your world becomes when someone cannot unsettle you with a sigh, when pressure no longer hijacks your clarity, when guilt no longer compels you to sacrifice your boundaries, when fear no longer pushes you into choices you regret. Imagine interacting with the world while being unshakably rooted in yourself. You would no longer fear manipulation, because nothing inside you would be loose enough for someone to pull. This is the transformation the Stoics pointed to, the moment when the mind shifts from being shaped to becoming the shaper. A shift from emotional vulnerability to internal authority. And once you understand how this shift works, manipulation becomes powerless. Not because it disappears, but because it can no longer reach you. Now that the stage is set, we move into the first chapter, where we expose the silent mechanism behind every subtle attempt to control your emotions and decisions. Once you see this mechanism clearly, you will never fall for it again. The manipulation loop, how they take control without you noticing. Most manipulation does not begin with a threat. It begins with a small fracture in your awareness, a subtle shift in how you interpret someone's behavior, a moment where you stop acting from your center and begin reacting from their influence. Every manipulator, whether intentional or not, relies on this same psychological pattern. It is a loop so quiet and so familiar that most people go through their entire lives without ever noticing it. But once you learn to recognize it, the entire game falls apart. The loop always begins with a trigger. A trigger is any external cue designed to provoke an emotional response. It might be disappointment on someone's face. It might be a carefully timed silence. It might be urgency, guilt, or a sudden spike of pressure. What matters is not the trigger itself, but what happens inside you the moment you feel it. Your attention narrows, your breath shortens, your thinking becomes reactive. You start interpreting the moment less through clarity and more through instinct. This is where the manipulator takes their first step inside your mind. The second phase is the emotional hijack. You start feeling responsible for someone else's discomfort. You feel compelled to fix the situation, even when you did nothing wrong. You feel guilty without understanding why. You fear disappointing someone who has no real authority over your life. In this stage, the emotional reaction is no longer about the present moment. It becomes a replay of past conditioning and unresolved fears. That is why manipulators rarely need force. They only need to activate the emotional patterns already living inside you. The third phase is the loss of agency. Your internal compass shifts from what is right for you to what will calm the situation. You make choices driven by discomfort instead of intention. You say yes when your entire being is saying no. You change your behavior to avoid tension, conflict, or rejection. This is the moment when the manipulator takes control without lifting a hand. They do not overpower you. They simply redirect you. They guide your reactions until you begin acting against yourself. The final phase is compliance, not because you agree with the outcome, but because you want the emotional pressure to stop. You give in, you adjust, you bend, not from weakness but from the unconscious belief that the fastest way back to peace is through self-abandonment. The tragedy is that this belief feels true only because it has been practiced for so long. This is the loop the Stoics exposed with ruthless clarity. They understood that manipulation is not an external force. It is an internal surrender. It happens when you allow your emotions to become levers that anyone can pull. And the moment you begin to see this loop in action, something powerful shifts. You no longer mistake pressure for authority. You no longer confuse urgency with importance. You no longer assume that someone else's feelings are your responsibility. You step out of the loop instead of spinning inside it. The next chapter reveals the deeper layer beneath this mechanism. It is not the manipulator's strength that gives them influence over you. It is something far more personal, far more honest, and far more transformative once you understand it. The true source of power, the opinion you fear the most. The uncomfortable truth is that most manipulation succeeds not because someone else is powerful, but because you are afraid of losing something you believe they control. Approval, acceptance, belonging, safety, validation, respect. These are the silent currencies that shape human behavior more than any external force. And the Stoics understood something brutally honest about them. You are not manipulated by people. You are manipulated by the opinions you fear losing. Think about this carefully. A person cannot pressure you unless you value their reaction more than your own judgment. They cannot guilt-trip you unless you secretly fear being seen as selfish. They cannot intimidate you unless you believe they hold something essential to your identity. In every case, the manipulator does not hold the real power. The power comes from your unexamined need, the need to be liked, the need to be accepted, the need to avoid conflict, the need to protect an image of yourself that others validate. These needs form invisible strings attached to your emotions. Anyone who learns to tug them gains influence over you without ever raising their voice. Marcus Aurelius said that our minds are shaped not by events, but by the interpretations we cling to. If you cling to the belief that someone's approval defines your worth, they will control you. If you cling to the belief that peace must be maintained at any cost, you will surrender your boundaries every time tension appears. If you cling to the belief that you must prove your value, you will fall into every trap designed to make you question it. Manipulators do not break down strong people. They feed on the insecurities strong people hide. So the question becomes simple, yet confronting. Whose opinion carries too much weight inside you? Whose disappointment makes you shrink? Whose silence makes you anxious? Whose approval makes you compromise your truth? Naming these influences is uncomfortable, but it is the beginning of liberation. The Stoics taught that clarity is the first form of freedom. When you see the unseen force driving your reactions, you reclaim the ability to choose your response instead of collapsing into automatic patterns. When you detach your identity from the opinions of others, something remarkable happens. The emotional hooks fail to sink in. The manipulator's tactics lose their leverage. You no longer interpret someone's frustration as a judgment against your worth. You no longer feel responsible for fixing emotions that were never yours to carry. You no longer fear the temporary discomfort that comes with standing your ground. You begin to operate from a place of internal authority rather than external permission. This is the essence of the Stoic shift. The moment you stop valuing anything outside yourself more than what is inside you. When your self-respect becomes non-negotiable, no one can use approval as a weapon. When your peace is grounded in clarity rather than compliance, No one can use tension to control you. When your identity is rooted in your actions rather than others' interpretations, you become immune to psychological pressure. The next chapter reveals the exact mechanism behind this transformation. It shows how to replace emotional instinct with Stoic interpretation, breaking manipulation at the precise point where it enters your mind. The Stoic shift: interpretation over instinct. Most people believe they are reacting to what others do, but the Stoics knew the truth runs deeper. You never react to an action. You react to the meaning you assign to it. A raised voice is only vibrations in the air until you interpret it as a threat. A silence is only the absence of words until you interpret it as disapproval. A delay in someone's message is nothing more than time passing until you interpret it as rejection. The event itself is harmless. The interpretation is what shapes your response. And this is where manipulation gains or loses its power. The Stoic shift happens at the exact moment you learn to separate the trigger from the interpretation. When you feel the pressure rising inside you, and instead of letting instinct take over, you step back mentally and examine the meaning you are about to attach to the moment. Suddenly, the world becomes clearer. What once felt personal becomes neutral information. What once felt emotionally urgent becomes simply another human behavior that has nothing to do with your value. This shift is not coldness. It is clarity. It is the ability to see without distortion. Imagine someone tries to guilt trip you. Your instinct might say you did something wrong. Your interpretation determines how deeply this lands. If your inner narrative says, "I must keep everyone comfortable," then guilt becomes a leash. But if your interpretation shifts to, "Their emotions are their responsibility," the guilt loses its grip. Nothing changed in the external world. The shift happened inside you. And the moment your interpretation changes, you become untouchable. Epictetus taught that people are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them. This is not just philosophy, it is psychology. Every manipulator relies on the assumption that you will interpret their behavior in the way they expect. They count on you feeling pressured, ashamed, or afraid. They depend on your emotional reflexes running unchecked. But when you pause and question the story in your mind, their control evaporates. They cannot use what you refuse to internalize. This shift becomes even more powerful when you start recognizing that most manipulative behavior comes from the other person's patterns, not your actions. Someone's anger is often a reflection of their own insecurities. Someone's urgency reveals their lack of patience. Someone's guilt-tripping exposes their lack of boundaries. When you interpret their behavior as information about them, rather than a verdict on you, the emotional weight disappears. You become the observer instead of the target. This is the pivot from instinct to interpretation, a moment where you reclaim authorship over your internal world. When you stop letting people's actions write the narrative in your mind, when you stop letting external events dictate your emotional state. This is the moment when manipulation fails because the entry point is gone. The door that once opened so easily is no longer unlocked. The Stoic shift turns your mind into a steady surface. People can push against it, but nothing moves unless you choose to move. And that is real power, the ability to choose your inner response before the world chooses it for you. In the next chapter, we expose the 4 silent emotional triggers that manipulators rely on. Once you see them clearly, you will recognize every attempt before it even begins. The silent manipulation triggers, where your defenses are weak. Manipulation is rarely loud. It does not need aggression, force, or dramatic confrontation. The most effective forms of influence slip into your mind through emotional openings you never realized were exposed. These openings are not flaws or weaknesses. They are human tendencies shaped by experience, fear, and unresolved expectations. But once you learn to see them, they lose their power immediately. The Stoics understood that the enemy is never the outside pressure. The true danger lies in the part of you that reacts without awareness. That is where the silent triggers live. The first trigger is the need for approval. When your sense of worth leans even slightly on how others perceive you, you become vulnerable to their reactions. A manipulator does not need to insult you. They only need to withdraw praise, shift their tone, or show subtle disappointment. If you fear being seen as wrong or inadequate, you begin adjusting your behavior to protect your image rather than your truth. This is how people with no real authority gain control over your emotional world. The Stoic counter is understanding that worth is internal, not negotiated through external validation. The second trigger is urgency. When someone pushes you to react quickly, your clarity collapses. Urgency bypasses rational thinking and activates instinct. Manipulators create pressure, not because the moment requires it, but because they know pressure forces compliance. They know a hurried mind clings to the easiest answer, not the right one. The Stoic mindset disrupts this entirely. A calm mind refuses to be rushed. A person who pauses cannot be pushed. The third trigger is guilt. Guilt is one of the most effective tools for controlling people who care deeply. It makes you feel responsible for emotions that do not belong to you. It makes you question your boundaries, your choices, and sometimes even your character. But guilt becomes a weapon only when you accept it without examination. The Stoics taught that you must evaluate whether a feeling is earned or imposed. When you learn to separate your responsibility from someone else's manipulation, guilt loses all influence. The fourth trigger is doubt. Manipulators rarely need to convince you of anything. They only need to make you question yourself. Once your internal certainty wavers, they guide your decisions easily. Doubt enters when you rely on external reassurance instead of trusting your own judgment. The Stoic approach is to build a stable inner reference point. When you know your values, your direction, and your intentions, doubt cannot be used to steer you. These triggers are universal. Every human being has felt them. Manipulators simply learn how to exploit them. But the moment you recognize these triggers as patterns rather than truths, the control breaks. You begin to notice the shift in tone. You feel the rise of urgency. You sense the subtle guilt. You detect the creeping doubt. And instead of reacting, you analyze, you pause, you choose consciously. You deny the manipulator the one thing they depend on, your unconscious participation. The Stoic path is not about shutting down emotion. It is about preventing emotion from becoming an entry point for external control. When you master the awareness of these silent triggers, you no longer move through the world as someone who can be pushed or pulled. You move as someone grounded, deliberate, and immune to the psychological tactics that once shaped your choices. In the next chapter, we go deeper into the heart of Stoic resilience. You will learn how emotional neutrality becomes the shield that stops manipulation before it begins. Emotional neutrality, how Stoics stay calm under psychological attack. There is a moment right before you react to someone's pressure where your entire life could take a different direction. A moment so small most people never notice it. A moment where your emotions begin to rise, your breath tightens, and your instincts prepare to take over. This is the moment where manipulation succeeds or fails. Not in the external world, but in the internal space where meaning is formed. The Stoics identified this moment with precision. They understood that emotional neutrality is not the absence of feeling. It is the mastery of the space between stimulus and response. When someone tries to manipulate you, their first objective is to destabilize you emotionally. They need you reactive, not reflective. They need you invested in their tone, their urgency, their disappointment. They need you to feel something strong enough that you abandon your clarity. Emotional neutrality interrupts this entire strategy. It is the ability to hold your inner state steady, even as external pressure rises. It turns you into someone who cannot be pushed off center because you no longer hand over your emotions to the situation unfolding around you. Neutrality begins with awareness. The Stoics trained themselves to notice the first signs of emotional activation, noticing the tightening in the chest, the heat behind a defensive thought, the sudden urge to justify, explain, or argue. These early signals are the openings through which manipulation enters. When you learn to recognize them, you gain a choice that most people never realize they have. Instead of reacting, you pause. Instead of spiraling into instinct, you observe. This pause is not weakness, it is power in its purest form. It is a deliberate refusal to let someone else dictate the rhythm of your mind. From this pause, you move into interpretation. You ask yourself what is actually happening, not what your emotion is telling you is happening. You separate the behavior from the meaning. You examine the intention behind the pressure. You question whether the discomfort you feel belongs to you or to them. This mental shift dissolves the emotional fog that manipulation depends on. Suddenly, the situation appears clearer. You see the tactic, you understand the motive, you regain your perspective. Emotional neutrality does not mean you become detached from humanity. It means you stop allowing momentary emotions to hijack your judgment. You can still feel deeply, but you choose the timing and direction of your feelings. You do not let them be stirred up by external triggers. This is why Stoics were so difficult to manipulate. Their emotional world was under their command, not under the influence of whoever happened to be speaking the loudest or projecting the most pressure. Imagine someone tries to shame you into compliance. Instead of absorbing the shame, you observe their behavior as a pattern. Instead of reacting defensively, you ask yourself what they gain by making you feel small. Instead of collapsing under pressure, you hold steady and respond from clarity. When you respond from neutrality, the manipulator loses their grip. They cannot influence someone who refuses to be emotionally entangled. The strength of emotional neutrality is that it becomes instant over time. The more you practice, the faster your mind returns to center. The more you witness your reactions, the more control you gain. Eventually, you reach a point where external pressure feels like wind hitting a mountain, noticeable but irrelevant, present but powerless. In the next chapter, we explore a powerful insight. Manipulators collapse when their tactics no longer work. You will see how a calm, grounded presence becomes the mirror that exposes their strategy and strips it of all power. The manipulator's mirror, when you stop playing their game. A manipulator's power does not come from their intelligence, strategy, or emotional intensity. Their power comes from your participation. Their entire method relies on the assumption that you will respond in predictable ways, that you will chase approval, that you will fear tension, that you will fold under pressure, that you will react emotionally rather than think clearly. When these reactions disappear, something remarkable happens. The manipulator loses their script. Their control begins to fracture. They are exposed by the very stillness they tried to disrupt. Stoics understood this dynamic with precision. They knew that when someone cannot provoke you, they cannot guide you. When someone cannot guilt you, they cannot push you. When someone cannot confuse you, they cannot lead you into decisions that go against your values. Your calm presence becomes a mirror that reflects their tactics back at them. Manipulators depend on emotional chaos. When they encounter emotional order, they become unsettled. They push harder at first, then falter, because the system they rely on is no longer functioning. Imagine someone tries to shame you into compliance. They expect you to defend yourself, explain yourself, or collapse under pressure. Instead, you remain steady. You listen without absorbing. You interpret their behavior rather than internalize it. You respond with clarity rather than intensity. Suddenly, they are left with their own tactic, staring back at them like a reflection they cannot escape. This is the moment when a manipulator realizes they cannot reach you. Not because you are distant, but because you are grounded. Not because you fight, but because you refuse to enter the emotional arena where they operate. Most people assume manipulators are confident. In reality, manipulation is often a mask for insecurity. It is a strategy used by those who cannot tolerate losing control. When you stop reacting, they feel the loss of control immediately. Their frustration is not about your behavior, it is about their fading influence. You are no longer functioning as their emotional extension. You no longer bend around their expectations. You no longer carry the weight of their moods. You no longer give them the psychological grip they depended on. Your presence becomes the pressure they once used against you. A steady presence exposes instability. A calm mind exposes emotional disorganization. A grounded response exposes their attempts to create chaos. This is why manipulators often escalate before collapsing. They sense the shift. They feel their tactics weakening. They try harder. Their urgency spikes. Their guilt intensifies. Their tone hardens. But the person who has embraced the Stoic shift remains centered. You do not match their escalation. You do not mirror their intensity. Your calm becomes the dominant force in the interaction. And eventually, the manipulator does something they never expect to do. They retreat, not because you defeated them, but because you stopped feeding the mechanism that gave them power. Manipulation only works in a relational dance. You stepped out. The dance ended. They have nothing left to pull, nothing left to push, nothing left to twist. They cannot play a game you refuse to engage in. This is the paradox of Stoic strength. You win not by fighting, but by refusing to abandon yourself. You break manipulation not through confrontation, but through clarity. The moment your internal world stops reacting to external pressure, you become someone who cannot be steered by emotional tactics. In the next chapter, we go deeper into the heart of this resilience. You will learn how to build the inner fortress that keeps your mind sovereign, your emotions steady, and your identity untouched by the chaos of others. Building the inner fortress, a mind that cannot be influenced. There comes a point in every person's life when they realize that strength is not measured by how loudly they speak or how forcefully they defend themselves. True strength is measured by how little the external world can disturb the internal one. This is the essence of the Stoic inner fortress, a mental structure built not from walls of indifference, but from foundations of clarity, intention, and self-respect. When this inner fortress is built correctly, manipulation becomes impossible because nothing inside you is loose enough for someone to pull. The inner fortress begins with emotional independence. Most people experience emotions as reactions to whatever is happening around them. Their mood rises and falls with the behavior of others. Their clarity strengthens or shatters depending on how people treat them. This makes them vulnerable to influence because their inner world is tied to external conditions. Emotional independence breaks this link. It is the ability to feel deeply while still choosing how you respond. You acknowledge emotion without obeying it. You experience pressure without submitting to it. You understand that your emotional state is your responsibility alone. The next foundation is identity rooted in values rather than approval. A person who does not know who they are will always seek confirmation from others. And anyone who gives confirmation can take it away. This becomes the entry point for manipulation. The Stoics taught that personal identity must be anchored in what you believe, what you stand for, and what you are committed to. When your values become the laws of your inner world, external opinions lose their authority. Praise cannot inflate you. Criticism cannot dismantle you. You become consistent, not reactive. Another pillar of the inner fortress is purpose. The manipulator thrives when you are unfocused, confused, or drifting. People who lack direction are easier to guide, easier to pressure, and easier to control. But the moment you establish a clear purpose, your decisions become aligned with something higher than the moods of others. You no longer ask what choice will make people happy. You ask what choice moves you toward the life you're building. Purpose acts like an internal compass that cannot be magnetized by someone else's emotions. The inner fortress also requires boundaries, not as lines drawn in anger, but as principles that protect your energy, your time, and your emotional balance. Boundaries are not about keeping people out. They are about keeping yourself intact. When you uphold boundaries with calm consistency, manipulators lose their leverage. They cannot use guilt if you refuse to carry guilt that is not yours. They cannot use urgency if you do not surrender your clarity to someone else's timeline. They cannot use tension if you are willing to tolerate discomfort in service of staying true to yourself. At the center of the inner fortress is presence. When you are fully aware of your thoughts, your reactions, and your interpretations, nothing enters your mind without your permission. You become vigilant without being paranoid, steady without being rigid. Presence is the watchtower of the mind. It is the awareness that prevents old patterns from re-emerging and new influences from slipping in unnoticed. What makes this fortress powerful is that it requires no aggression to maintain. There is no battle to fight, no enemy to conquer. You are not protecting yourself from the outside world. You are protecting your inner world from collapsing into old reactive habits. You are building a place within yourself that no one can enter unless you allow it. In the next chapter, you will learn the practical ritual that strengthens this fortress every single day. A simple yet profound practice that breaks manipulation at its root by training your mind to remain sovereign, steady, and unshakable. The freedom practice. A daily ritual that breaks manipulation at its root. Freedom is not something you achieve once and keep forever. Freedom is something you practice. The Stoics understood this better than anyone. They knew the mind drifts, old patterns return, and emotional reflexes reappear if they are not trained daily. Manipulation thrives when the mind functions unconsciously. It collapses when the mind functions with awareness. That is why the most powerful defense against manipulation is not a complex strategy. It is a simple ritual that trains your inner world to remain sovereign no matter what pressure surrounds you. This ritual begins with observation. Every morning, and especially in moments of tension, you take a single breath and observe what is happening inside you. Not what someone said, not what someone implied, not what someone wants. You observe your first emotional reaction. You notice whether it is fear, guilt, urgency, defensiveness, or confusion. Observation pulls you out of the automatic loop where manipulation functions. It reminds you that you are watching the emotion, not obeying it. The moment you observe your reaction, you reclaim authorship over your next move. The next part of the ritual is naming. This is where clarity strengthens. You name the emotion or trigger directly. You call it what it is without judgment. You say to yourself, "This is guilt," or "This is pressure," or "This is my need for approval being activated." Naming strips manipulation of its subtlety. It brings the unconscious into consciousness. It reveals the tactic, rather than letting it operate in the shadows. When you name the trigger, you separate it from your identity. You turn it into something you can work with, rather than something that works through you. After naming comes neutralization. This does not mean suppressing how you feel. It means returning the emotion to zero before choosing your next action. You neutralize by pausing, breathing, and letting the initial emotional spike settle. You allow the mind to clear. You remind yourself that urgency is rarely real, that guilt is often misplaced, and that the opinions you fear losing have no authority over your truth. Neutralization is the step manipulators fear the most because it dissolves the emotional momentum they rely on to steer your decisions. The final part of the ritual is conscious choice. Once you observe, name, and neutralize, you no longer act from instinct. You act from intention. You choose your words instead of reacting. You choose your boundaries instead of collapsing into compliance. You choose your direction instead of being guided by someone else's agenda. Conscious choice is the act that transforms a reactive life into a deliberate one. It is the moment where you prove to yourself that you are no longer controlled by hidden triggers or emotional conditioning. Practiced daily, this ritual becomes a mental reflex. You begin to notice pressure rising before it overwhelms you. You hear the tone behind someone's words without absorbing their meaning. You feel the emotional bait, but refuse to bite. You catch yourself before old patterns take over. And eventually, the ritual becomes second nature. Manipulation loses its grip, not because the world becomes easier, but because your mind becomes stronger. This practice is the heartbeat of freedom. It returns your power piece by piece until your entire inner world belongs to you again. It gives you the clarity to navigate difficult people, the steadiness to withstand emotional storms, and the strength to choose your life rather than inherit it from external expectations. In the next chapter, we bring everything together with a final message about what it truly means to reclaim your mind. When this shift becomes permanent, you no longer fear manipulation because you no longer fear yourself. Conclusion: when your mind returns to you, there comes a moment in every journey of self-mastery when you realize that the battles you thought were happening outside of you were never truly external. The pressure you felt, the guilt that shaped your choices, the anxiety that pulled you in different directions, All of it grew from the interpretations you accepted without question. The world did not change when you began this path. You changed. You stopped giving automatic meaning to other people's behaviors. You stopped allowing old emotional patterns to pull you into predictable reactions. You stopped letting the needs, fears, and insecurities of others define the direction of your life. Your mind returned to you. This is the deepest victory the Stoics ever offered. Not dominance over others, but sovereignty over yourself. You now understand how manipulation operates. You see the loop that once caught you. You recognize the emotional triggers that used to hijack your clarity. You know where the real power lived all along, in the interpretations you choose and the identity you uphold. You no longer act from fear of losing approval. You no longer surrender your boundaries to avoid discomfort. You no longer silence your truth to maintain an illusion of peace. You no longer abandon yourself just to hold the world together. You have built something stronger than defenses. You have built inner clarity. You have built emotional independence. You have built a presence that cannot be pushed off center. And because of this, you move through the world differently now. You listen without absorbing. You feel without collapsing. You respond without reacting. You hold steady in moments where you once would have spiraled. This is the difference between a mind that is owned by the world and a mind that belongs to itself. When manipulation loses its grip, life becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. You no longer waste energy interpreting every shift in someone's tone. You no longer tie your identity to their approval or their disappointment. You no longer fear tension, because you know discomfort is not a threat to your worth. You no longer negotiate your truth in exchange for temporary harmony. Instead, you stand where you are, grounded in values rather than emotions, guided by purpose rather than pressure. This transformation does not make you cold. It makes you whole. You become someone who loves without losing themselves, someone who cares without collapsing under the weight of responsibility that was never theirs, someone who stays open without surrendering their center. When your mind is yours again, connection becomes real, decisions become clean, and your life becomes intentional. The Stoics never promised a world free of manipulation. They promised a mind strong enough to move through that world untouched. You have reached that point. And from here on, every interaction, every challenge, every moment of tension becomes an opportunity to practice the sovereignty you have built. You are no longer shaped by external forces. You are the one shaping your path. Your mind has returned home. And once you experience this level of clarity, you never allow it to be taken again.